Thank you very much, Dr. Chawla, for giving me this opportunity to present this first topic of our pulmonology course. And as all must be knowing that this is about the oxygen and drugs in pediatric pulmonology. So without wasting much of time, I will just start with the topic straight. So oxygen therapy for children, this picture itself suggestive of that there are not many modalities are there by which we can give oxygen to kids, like maybe prongs, cannula, catheter, and there will be other varieties by which we can give. So let us see why we are so much interested in oxygen therapy, because we all know there is pneumonia is the biggest cause of mortality in under 5. Approximately 80% of your child gets died because of pneumonia, and hypoxemia is the biggest etiology which leads to, which is basically outcome of a pneumonia, and it's basically a common complication of pneumonia which is responsible for morbidity and mortality. Apart from that, we have also seen that in neonatal age group, 23% of the we can say like 5.9 million annual child death result from neonatal conditions such as asphyxia, sepsis, and low birth weight, all of which also can lead to hypoxemia. So despite its importance, hypoxemia is often not well recognized or managed in resource limited settings, especially with what we have seen recently during COVID also, because our whole country was suffering with lack of proper supply of oxygen. So oxygen is such a important drug itself. Probably it is always underestimated in our country. So more reliable detection of hypoxemia could be achieved through more widespread use of non-invasive pulse oximetry, which we did very wonderfully during this COVID, which we are doing that regularly during COVID. And so we all endorse that oxygen therapy must be more widely available, whether it's for adults or pediatrics, but definitely in pediatrics, it has got a very important role to prevent the mortality in long run. So what is hypoxemia? If we go in short, hypoxemia means low level of oxygen in the blood. It's a very literal meaning of the hypoxemia. And hypoxia is basically an outcome of hypoxemia, which leads to hypoxia, which is because of the inadequate oxygen in tissues for normal cells and organ function, and which is basically resultant of hypoxemia. Pulse oximetry is the one modality by which we can detect the hypoxemia is there or not. So at sea level, we say 97 to 95, 99% is the level by which we can say whether it's normal level by which we estimate. And if we get to like 2 standard minus deviation, then we can say up to 94 is the normal level at the sea, by which we can say this is a normal lower limit of the saturation, and below if it is like little bit of alarming for us. RT blood gas analysis, or ABG, is another way of estimating oxygen in the blood. Although it should be more accurate, but sometimes it has been observed over the long period that it gives a lot of faulty results also, because a lot many things like ABG has its own drawbacks. It's expensive technology, it's expensive methodology. Measurements can easily result from factors such as poorly taken sample, laboratory errors, inadequate maintenance or quality control in the laboratory, delay in transfer of the sample to the laboratory, invasive and uncomfortable for the children. So these are certain drawbacks of ABG, and but only one benefit of ABG is it gives idea about the pH, PaCO2, as well as the about information about the electrolytes. Okay, so if you go about the quality of evidence and recommendation, so what is the utility of pulse oximetry? Although what I could find out through the available literature, this is which although I have not quoted reference here, but this is what has been given in the WHO manual, like use of pulse oximetry to detect hypoxemia. Pulse oximetry is recommended for determining the presence of hypoxemia and for guiding administration of oxygen to infants and children. It has got very strong recommendation, but the quality of evidence was quite low as per the available recommendations in that use. Then when clinical science, so when pulse oximetry is not there and we are going to have some on the basis of clinical science, then central cyanosis, nasal flaring, inability to drink or feed, grunting with every breath, and depressed mental state, all this condition has got again a strong recommendation suggestive of hypoxemia, and again it's the quality of evidence is low. And in some situation, and depending on the overall clinical condition, children with the following less specific signs may also need oxygen, that is severe low lower chest wall indrawing respiratory rate more than 70 per minute. Although probably this is they are talking in general. If you go according to IMNCI, it may vary as per the age classification, and the criteria may be altogether different. And head nodding. So all these three comes under the, again, strong recommendation, but very low quality evidence. Now, if we go into detail of oxygen, that how oxygen therapy can be given. So we all know, we have been routinely, we all use this. So there are primarily three mechanisms or three standard methods by which we provide oxygen to our patients in hospital. One is cylinder, another is concentrator, and third is the pipeline. So oxygen cylinders, we all have seen throughout our residency, especially, and this, till also we are using cylinder in wards, especially in government setup. It is very commonly used. Oxygen concentrators are something like which usually utilize more or less in either we can say in the domiciliary purpose, or especially in the peripheral centers where the oxygen cylinders or oxygen pipeline facilities are not available. So concentrator has got its own benefits and drawbacks, which we'll discuss in short. It's basically oxygen concentrator supply oxygen at a concentration of say 90 to 96%. It's a safe, less expensive, reliable, cost efficient source of oxygen, more convenient than oxygen cylinders because of it is easy to carry, can provide a continuous supply of oxygen for up to 4 patients at the same time when used with flow splitters or flow meters. Concentrators nevertheless require regular maintenance to ensure proper functioning and source of continuous power. And it can be run on AC mains power generator, or solar power. But whenever we are using AC, when you are using concentrator, we always should have one cylinder as a backup, because we never know when this concentrator will fail to provide the enough amount of oxygen. And the second thing is maximum oxygen which you can provide with the help of concentration, that is concentrated, that is 10 liter per minute, which is theoretical. What is my personal experience says there are two type of concentrators which are available. One is 5 liter supply, and second is 10 liter. So I've never seen any oxygen concentrator is able to supply more than 7 or 8 liter per minute. So I don't think it is possible. Theoretically, the market, the products which are available in the market, they claims that they can provide up to 10 liter per minute. Probably at the end of discussion, some of us may be having better experience than what I experienced. So we'll discuss. Third is like which we usually see in our ICU setups, like or most of the private setup also do have, even in the wards, they have central piped oxygen system. In larger hospital, oxygen is distributed through a system of copper pipes from a central source. The source may be liquid oxygen, high pressure gaseous oxygen cylinders, a large oxygen concentrator, or a combination. Pipeline systems supply oxygen at a high pressure to equipment such as ventilators, or if you talk about the anesthetic machines, which we are commonly used in the OT. Advantages is it reduces the risk of fire, obvious handling and transporting heavy cylinders in the wards, and the high cost of installing centralized oxygen sources with copper pipelines and their maintenance makes this system of oxygen delivery unusable for many smaller hospitals. So definitely it's the best way to provide oxygen to all sick patients who require the oxygen, but definitely it is not at all a cost effective. So when we weigh the cost benefit analysis, sometimes probably this will come at the receiving end, and that's why we don't have majority of even government setups not having, apart from ICU, not having the central pipe oxygen system delivery system is there installed. So method of delivery, if we divide the methods, we can broadly classify them into two categories. One is non-invasive and another is a semi-invasive. Non-invasive basically through a face mask, head box, incubator or tent, or a holding tube close to an infant's face. Sometimes we must have seen in the busy government setups, a mother has been asked to keep to hold the tube, and just she's cupping the hand, and the tube, the oxygen tubing is inside her cup, inside that cup, and then she's trying to provide the oxygen to the other. It's a very crude way of giving oxygen, but that is one of the way. The rest of the things are not available, like face mask or head box, and it is a very common thing, especially during COVID. We have seen a lot many such similar conditions during this pandemic. Semi-invasive methods like insertion of prongs or catheters into upper airway. This is something which is very interesting, and we have to discuss, I think, in a little bit more lengthy way, which we'll discuss in coming slides. Method require a low oxygen flow, because semi-invasive requires low oxygen flow and cheaper than non-invasive methods. Nasal and nasopharyngeal catheters have beneficial effect apart from its cost, as it produces the PEEP up to 5 centimeter H2. Now it also depends upon how much PEEP it will be producing and which catheter and infant what will be produced, how much PEEP will be produced. Again, it's a question of discussion. We will do it. PEEP production may also be effective in the management of apnea associated with prematurity or bronchiolitis. So if you again go as per the quality of evidence and recommendation, nasal prongs are the preferred method for delivering oxygen to infants and children less than 5 years of age with hypoxemia. It's a strong recommendation with moderate quality evidence. When nasal prongs are not available, nasal or nasopharyngeal catheters can be used as an alternative delivery method. Face mask and head box are usually not recommended, and it's again a strong recommendation. Standard flow rates for oxygen through nasal prongs or nasal catheters are 0.5 to 1 liter per minute for neonates, 1 to 2 liter for infants, and 1 to 4 liter for older children. These are certain recommendations which are given in the WHO manual, and again it's a strong recommendation with moderate quality evidence. If we compare the variety of devices, starting from nasal cannula to simple face mask to the breathing mask. So the maximal flow rate for nasal cannula is 0.5 to 4 liter per minute. Simple face mask is 6 to 10 liter per minute. Partial rebreathing 10 to 12. Non-rebreathing, which we commonly know as NRBM, 10 to 12 liter or 10 to 15 liter. Oxygen note 10 to 15 liter per minute, oxygen 10 to 15, and Venturi mask is variable. So maximal FiO2 which is achievable by variety of the mask and cannulas is ranging from variable to 30 to 60, or even in oxygen we can achieve up to 80 to 90%. Entrainment of room air is usually possible in all the conditions with all the type of equipments except the NRBM and oxygen route, in which the entrainment of room air is relatively not that possible. So we will go one by one with each modalities. Nasal prongs are device that ends in two short tapered tubes about 1 centimeter in length, designed to lie just beneath the nostrils. They are also called as nasal cannulae. Standard flow rate, as we already discussed, it is 0.5 to 1 liter per minute for neonates, 1 to 2 liter for infants, and 1 to 4 liter for older children. Now it is something like arbitrarily it has been decided somewhere plus minus we always keep on doing depending upon the SpO2 level in our patient. So it is not hard and fast that we have to keep between these only, but definitely it is the recommended range in which we have to give oxygen through cannulas in neonates, infants, and older child. There is no risk of gastric distension at a standard flow rate, as they cannot be inserted too far into nasal passage. Humidification is not required because the rest of the whole passage is intact. So rest of the existing mechanism of humidification of air, which we normally our body does. So similarly, the same mechanism will be used for the oxygenation of the for the humidification of the oxygen. So there is no separate humidification mechanism as such is required. FiO2 depends on the oxygen flow rate, the relation between prong and nasal catheter diameters, and patient's body weight. So there are a lot many other factors which itself helps in getting the FiO2 in the individual child or individual baby. So nasal prong is a slight, there's a slight risk that airway will become obstructed by mucus, especially if a high flow with no humidification is used. So normally as such humidification is not advisable, but if we are keeping too much of high flow of oxygen, then sometimes it may be the prongs will get blocked at the end, and it may cause a drying. And achievement of PEEP again depends on the distal prong diameter, the oxygen flow, and body weight. Whereas 1 liter per minute of oxygen may produce a PEEP of about 5 centimeter H2 in premature infants, but there is no significant PEEP production with the same flow in infants weighing up to 2 kg. So what flow you are using and with whom to whom you are giving that flow, it also makes a sense whether the enough amount of PEEP will be produced or not. So the second device or second modality which we use for the management or oxygenation is nasal catheter. Is a thin flexible tube which is passed into nose and ends with its tip in the nasal cavity. Usually well tolerated, and they are unlikely to be dislodged. Oxygen does not have to be humidified because again we are just putting it inside the we are putting this catheter only in the nasal cavity only. So there is a little risk of displacement into esophagus with consequent risk of gastric distension. Actual FiO2 values of PEEP achieved with nasal catheters have not been yet published because studies are not available that how much FiO2 can be achieved or PEEP can be achieved with the help of nasal catheters. Nasal catheters are comparatively less efficient in improving oxygenation than nasopharyngeal catheter, but it has got lesser complications. That's why sometimes if nasal prongs, if you have to choose out of nasopharyngeal and nasal catheters are preferred, but definitely nasopharyngeal is more efficient. So we have to weigh what is more required. Whether hypoxemia is more severe, then probably we'll have to go with the nasopharyngeal catheter. In neonates and infants, 8 French size catheter can be used. A catheter passed for a distance equal to distance from inside of the nostril to the, like from the nostril to the inner margin of the eyebrow, usually reaches to the posterior part of the nasal cavity. The tip of the catheter should not be visible below the uvula. A catheter is easily secured with the tape above the upper lip. So we can easily I think there's a lot of disturbance. Am I audible completely? Hello?
Yeah,
Hello? Yeah, there's a lot of background noises there, so that's why. Yes. So okay, thank you. A catheter is easily secured with tape with the tap above the upper lip, and maximum flow rate should be set at 0.5 to 1 liter per minute for neonates and 1 to 2 liter for infants and children. Nasogastric tube should be placed at the same time in the same nostril so as not to obstruct the both nostrils simultaneously. So this is something how we place the nasal catheter, and it reaches just at the end of your nasal cavity. It doesn't enter into your pharynx part. Nasopharyngeal catheter is the third variety by which we provide oxygen. Nasopharyngeal catheter is inserted to the nose to a depth of 1 centimeter, less than the distance from the side of the nose to the front of the ear, that is tragus. In neonates and infants, again 8 French catheters should be used. Maximum flow rate should be set at 0.5 liter per minute for neonates and 1 liter per minute for infants. High flow rates may be cause drying of nasal mucosa, bleeding, and airway obstruction. It is as same as with the nasal catheter only, because there is a risk of gastric distension. Because now here we are putting it more, towards pharynx side. There's always chance that some amount of air or it may get dislodged into esophagus, or some amount of air may go into the stomach. So gastric distension possibility is always there. So we have to always keep nasogastric tube along with it, and the catheter should be removed and cleaned at least twice daily, because it is this catheter has got more tendency to get obstructed over the period of time. So we have to always remove twice a day and to clean it. Humidification is always required, and the humidifier should be filled to correct level of distilled water, as we always do with the rest of the devices. Nasopharyngeal catheter is the most economical all the methods described here in terms of conservation of oxygen wastage. Better oxygenation is achieved with lower oxygen flow than with nasal prongs because of relatively high FiO2 in the trachea and significant production of PEEP. Because this is something which is very unique about nasopharyngeal. It produces enough amount of PEEP also when we are giving it the good amount of flow. Although flow requirement is comparatively lesser than the nasal cannula and nasal prong. So in infants, 1 liter per minute of nasopharyngeal oxygen given through 8 French catheter produces PEEP of say 2.8 centimeter of water. And because of reliable production of moderate PEEP, oxygen administration by a nasopharyngeal catheter retains a place in the management of patients with severe hypoxia. Nasopharyngeal oxygen delivery may also be used in hospitals with very limited oxygen supply, but only problem with nasopharyngeal catheter is that it requires very supervision and strict monitoring, because once it gets dislodged, it can produce a lot of problems also. So the type of catheter is used passed to the pharynx and just below the level of uvula. It requires close supervision. Settings where frequent monitoring is difficult, nasal prongs or nasal catheters are the preferred method, except in the children where severe hypoxemia, whom cyanosis or oxygen saturation is not relieved by oxygen given by a nasal prongs or nasal. So if nasal prongs or nasal catheters are not sufficient, then only we can go for the nasopharyngeal catheter. And if it is you are giving with nasopharyngeal catheter, then in that case scenario, proper supervision and proper nursing care is required. Head box is incubator, stents, and face mask, which we commonly all of us have used some of the time in our career. So advantage, actual FiO2 can be determined precisely when an oxygen analyzer placed near the infant's mouth. There is no increased risk of airway obstruction by mucus or of gastric distension, and humidification is not necessary. But disadvantage is carbon dioxide toxicity can occur if the flow of oxygen is inadequate. This can result from setting the oxygen flow too low or from kinking of oxygen tubing, or head box is used with an inappropriately tight seal around the infant's neck and carbon dioxide can be retained. A gas flow of 2 to 3 liter per kg per minute is necessary to avoid rebreathing of carbon dioxide. So a bit high flow, which is most time that amount of oxygen is not utilized by the child, but it is the waste of oxygen. And especially when there is a scarcity of oxygen, this kind of devices are not that helpful. So head boxes and face masks are interfere with feeding also. Therefore, these methods are not recommended for oxygen administration, especially in setting where oxygen supplies are limited. Oral catheter is a very limited utilized device, but it is already available or it has been given in the literature. So I just will like to summarize what exactly it means. Experience with oropharyngeal catheter of delivery to children is limited and technique cannot be recommended. 8 French feeding tube to the mouth into the hypopharynx, equal in length to distance from side of the nose to the tragus of the ear. The tubes need to be changed once a day. Adequate oxygenation of preterm infants and respiratory distress and of infants with pneumonia and oxygen flow rate of say 0.5 to 1 liter per minute. No chance of tube displacement or blockage because we are already changing once a day. And secondly, it has been kept in the through oral cavity only. But few researchers claim that this method allows unobstructed gas exchange through both nostrils with feeding and oxygen tubes both by the oral route. But again, there is not much literature is available about the oral catheters. So I personally, if you ask me, I've never in our ICU, PICU never utilized it, so I don't have any idea about it, how it works. So probably Dr. Nitin will be able to give us some idea about it. If nasal prongs are used at maximum flow and the child is still hypoxemic, begin CPAP if equipment is available or consider mechanical ventilation. If CPAP is not available, give a second source of oxygen via oxygen mask, ideally with a reservoir bag to increase the fractional concentration of inspired oxygen, can give up to 10 to 15 liter per minute oxygen, that is NRBM. If second source of oxygen mask is not available, insert a nasopharyngeal catheter to give a higher fractional concentration of inspired oxygen, but never use prongs and catheter, nasopharyngeal catheter simultaneously. Now, during this COVID, one of the device which we used very frequently, even in adults as well as in pediatric, although pediatric we have not seen so much of hypoxic patients, but in adults definitely the HFNC, that is high flow nasal cannula, was very much used and relatively new non-invasive ventilation therapy delivered by a variety of devices. High flow is usually defined at a flow rate of more than 4 liter per minute, but ranging from 4 to 20 liter per minute, with some studies reporting flow as high as 70 liter per minute. High flow oxygen therapy may reduce the need for less tolerated or invasive procedure like BiPAP or CPAP or even mechanical ventilation. So these studies usually quotes that even HFNC is as user of the other modalities of mechanical ventilation and this invasive ventilation. HFNAC has been most frequently used for infants and young children who are hospitalized with bronchiolitis and who have respiratory distress despite receiving oxygen therapy and who do not respond properly or not tolerate CPAP or BiPAP. Limited evidence for safety, effectiveness, and relative cost analysis for HFNC, especially in pediatric population, is available. So, possible mechanism of action of HFNC is nasopharyngeal dead space washout, reduction of inspiratory resistance and work of breathing, providing positive and expiratory pressure to the lungs, and improvement of air conductance and pulmonary compliance by providing adequate heating and humidification, thereby reducing the effects of dry. So these are the possible mechanisms by which probably HFNC acts more actively than the other varieties. And patient comfort and safety by HFNC, studies in children and adults have shown HFNC to be more comfortable and associated with less dyspnea and mouth dryness than oxygen delivered via face mask. Improved patient tolerance may be one of the reasons for increasing use of high flow oxygen therapy or HFNC despite the lack of conclusive evidence of clinical effectiveness. And most studies demonstrate no or minimal adverse events. So till date, this is something which is in my knowledge or what I could form to available things. That is, it has got a little bit safer version and it requires lesser invasive variant. If you go according to the variety of the things like nasal prong, nasal catheter, nasopharyngeal catheter, and head box face mask, the rest of the things are already given. And in neonates, what can be the maximum we have already discussed, like maximum flow per minute can neonate 0.5 to 1, infants 2 liter per minute, preschool 4, school 6. Similarly, by nasal catheter 0.5 in infants 1. So these are the main purpose of this table is not this. The main purpose is First of all, the humidification is required in a nasopharyngeal catheter. And if you see about the nursing demand, nursing is, if you see the nasopharyngeal catheter and head box, if you are using, in both these conditions, they both require tremendous nursing care. So if your nursing care is appropriate, then only we should try to use these two things. Otherwise, nasal prong is the safest version for if oxygen demand is less, then nasal prong is the best thing which we can use at the our setup. And this is something like, and risk of hypercapnia, if you see, risk of hypercapnia is not there in nasal prong catheter or pharyngeal nasopharyngeal catheter, but is dramatically high in cases of head box or other sort of non-invasive variety, or say non-invasive variety like face mask and head box and all. So if you go according to the again quality of evidence and recommendation, children with hypoxemia should receive appropriate oxygen therapy. That is again strong recommendation. Nothing is unique about it. Administration of oxygen therapy should be guided by pulse oximetry when available. Oxygen with respiratory disease leaving it. Now something, this is, if as we go above the sea level, we all know that our respiratory level falls. But here the recommendation is already given that if children with respiratory disease and living at the height of say 2500 above sea level, then they should receive oxygen therapy if their oxygen saturation is 90% as measured by pulse oximetry. But here if you see the last fifth point, if children living at high altitude and the lungs are normal and it is more than 2500 above sea level, the normal oxygen saturation is lower than those living in sea level, that is normally which we expect. A high altitude, a lower level of saturation such as SpO2 of less than 87% should be used as a threshold for giving oxygen. So at high level, 87% or less should be taken as a threshold for giving oxygen. And with the patient at high level, at high altitude, but having a pre-existing respiratory diseases, in that condition, the saturation 90 cutoff should be taken. Similarly, when the child is having emergency signs, when respiratory distress, then cutoff should be taken as the 94%. Anything less than 94%, we should start giving the oxygen. Oxygenation and COVID, two slides are about oxygen and COVID, because we have seen a lot of problems during the COVID about oxygen. So give supplementary oxygen therapy to target SpO2 above 94% during resuscitation and above 90% for stable and recovering child. So nasal prongs or cannula are preferred in children as it may be better tolerated. Surgical mask or hood cover to decrease the risk of aerosolization and droplet spread, which is better because in the same where healthcare workers are actively working. So it is always better to use surgical mask or hood to prevent the aerosol spread. And if the child is in oxygen, is on oxygen through prongs and SpO2 less than 90 with minimal respiratory distress, option include either a face mask at flow 5 liter per minute, oxygen at flow 5 liter per minute, Venturi mask and non-rebreathe mask. So these all modalities can be used when you're treating any patient with any child with COVID. And respiratory support and HFNC, heated humidified high-flow nasal cannula may be useful, preferably over CPAP and BiPAP in the target saturation is not achieved. And again, start with the help of 0.5 to 1 liter per kg per minute and increase up to 2 liter per kg per minute. And target SpO2 is 90 to 94%. Monitor, as we all do, HR, RR, SpO2 workup breathing. If no response in 1 to 2 hours, then escalation of the support should be done. Consider providing a 3-ply mask to cover the mouth and nose of the child receiving HFNC to reduce the spread of aerosol. Now, sometimes we have observed that despite of giving the enough amount of, we are using all modalities and still the response is not there. And probably we may have lot many ideas in our brain that why oxygenation is not happening or why hypoxemia is not getting recovered. So before thinking something else, we should first of all rule out the following finding, that whether the oxygen flow is there or not. Sometimes oxygen cylinder is emptied, either the concentrator is not working, and all these things. So oxygen is flowing or not, we can just by putting it into the water beaker, we can see whether the oxygen bubbles are coming out of that or not. Oxygen tubing is either not, whether it's leaking or whether it's intact. Sometimes it may be a leak in the oxygen tube which may be causing this problem. Nasal prongs or catheters are fitted correctly or not blocked. So sometimes this blockage can itself lead to the not able to, it won't allow you to have improvement in the hypoxemia. And if the oxygen is being delivered by a concentrator, then concentration of oxygen delivered is adequate. So it should be more than 85%. When using oxygen concentrator, it is important to have an oxygen analyzer to measure the fraction of oxygen and the flow rate. So it is something which is again, recently, what I have seen, basically, I am from Gujarat, so lot many, during COVID, lot of appeal was there. So lot many NRIs have and given oxygen concentrated donated, and so our hospital also received, government hospital also received few of those concentrators, but majority of those concentrators are not having enough. Either they are not showing you this flow rate, only or the flow rate is there, but you cannot just titrate the amount. So only concentrator is there because it has been manufactured by some local manufacturer. It has been just dumped. Now I don't know how much it will be utilized, and majority of them are 5 liters only. So 5 liters of no use. If we are willing to give high concentration oxygen in future, probably that will be just an idle box will be lying in our store. So what are other possible causes of non-response, like effusion, pneumothorax, upper airway obstruction, bronchospasm, or some CCF, ventilator failure, like child respiratory effort is inadequate, or the child has slow or shallow breathing and child is lethargic. So in all this condition, you may not get response. It is not always the oxygenation failure because of the progression of the disease, but this may be something like other complication might have arisen in between. So monitoring of child on oxygen therapy, children receiving oxygen should be clinically monitored at least twice a day by pulse oximetry. This is what minimum is required. Otherwise, if the patient is an ICU, normally we keep patient on multi-per-hour monitor, and it's a 24-hour monitoring is going on. But especially when the patient is in the ward, then at least minimum 2 times SpO2 monitoring should be done. And correct oxygen delivery is happening or not. Sister should or nurse should check 3 hourly, at least once a day when child is clinically stable, and should be discontinued from oxygen for 10 to 15 minutes and carefully examined for changes in clinical signs and SPO to be to determine the need of supplemental oxygen. So whether patient is improving, how will you know? Because you'll have to reduce our support system. So when the patient's oxygen and SPO is maintained for more than 90%, then we have to try to reduce the oxygenation or stop oxygenation for 10 to 15 minutes, and then keep on observing the fall in SpO2. If it is not falling, then we can gradually increase. And the children should not be discharged until their SpO2 has been stable for 90 or more than 90% in room air for at least 24 hours, until all dangers have been resolved and appropriate home treatment has been explained and understood by the caregivers. Because now oxygen itself is a drug, we all know. So it has got its own side effects also. So retinopathia prematurity in neonates is very well known to all of us. So it's basically seen in commonly in preterms. CO2 narcosis, oxygen administration only corrects hypoxemia, not the ventilatory failure, which with increased CO2. In particularly important is those who have hypoventilation from neuromuscular weakness, where injudicious use of therapy can mask impending respiratory failure or arrest. Possible increasing of pulmonary blood flow, which can be deleterious in patients with certain cardiac pathologies. Oxygen therapy is associated with free radical production and subsequent damage into lung tissue, even the relatively short duration of oxygen therapy. So it is not always like that oxygen therapy given for a longer period of time only leads to free radical production and damage to the lung. Even a shorter duration can also cause the same thing. And persistent oxygen therapy, especially at high inspired concentration, can lead to fibrosis, pulmonary fibrosis, and increased risk of atelectasis. Second part of my talk is about drug, and as a variety of drugs are used for management of pulmonary disorders. So, but here I try to cover the inhalation route. Probably I think that is the most important thing, which we normally take care. Or what are the different type of inhalation devices, or which we should use properly, or what are different type of available in the market. And some of the medications are now latest available. I don't know how many of you are using like available inhalation antibiotic therapies. I have never used in my personally in my life, but I after reading this probably I would. But depending upon the available cases and all that and cost, I don't know whether it is available in India right now or not. So we will discuss in short about all those things. So inhalation therapy, oral therapy, injectable. So I am going to focus only about the inhalation therapy or inhalation drug therapy, which is utilized for management of pulmonary condition. So aerosolized medications, the delivery of medication directly to the airways is a mainstay of both the emergency treatment and long-term management of asthma, COPD, and other chronic lung diseases in both adult as well as pediatric population. Proper use of inhalation device is must to avoid high use error rates. Less than optimal delivery of aerosolized medication through improper technique or mismatched device can result in worsening of symptoms. Because we are already using the very small amount of medication, If that is also not improper, so probably it may lead to high degree of the outcome won't be that good, and probably patient won't get relief from the disease itself. This can often lead to incorrect assumption that the disease state is deteriorating. So what is basic difference between aerosol therapy and systemic? Like selective treatment of pulmonary condition by aerosol allows lower medication doses. We all know the amount drastically reduces. We want to use same amount of medication orally versus inhalation therapy. Rapid onset of action of bronchoactive medication, because at the site it produces its effect. Reduce incidence of side effects due to lower systemic bioavailability. Relative ease and convenience of self-administration by patients, parents, and caregivers for long-term use. Upper airway and intrapulmonary devices delivery is used for asthma. Like we normally use variety of medications. Like for asthma, we use corticosteroid, long and short-acting bronchodilators, and anticholinergic. Cystic fibrosis, corticosteroids, long and short-acting bronchodilators, antibiotics, hypertonic saline, Dornase alpha. Now, Dornase alpha is basically a sort of a DNA deoxyribonuclease enzyme, which is basically used to break the DNA present in the mucus, and it is characteristically used in cystic fibrosis, which helps in relieving the mucus, which is exclusive amount of mucus which is getting accumulated in the airways of the cystic fibrosis patient. Then croup patients, we give epinephrine and corticosteroid. In chronic lung disease of prematurity, corticosteroid, long and short acting bronchodilators. In pulmonary hypertension, vasodilators. Chronic airway infection associated with non-cystic fibrosis is bronchiectasis. Systemic delivery is used for diabetes and pain like opioids. So, but this last systemic delivery like diabetes and pain, like insulin and opioids, probably I have not covered this in my session, because insulin and opioids we don't normally use in pediatric population that much by this route. So I just skip that part. Aerosols are the suspension of liquid. There is a nebulizer in MDI, or solid particles like in DPI in a carrier gas. Aerosols are typically carried by three different parameters. So every aerosol has got three different parameters. First is MAMD, that is mass median aerodynamic diameter. A central tendency measurement represents the particle diameter, that is half of the drug mass below and above its size. So this MAMD basically decides how much of the drug will be delivered, and once it is removed from, released from the say MDI or from the DPI, how much it will be deposited in the mouth, or will be deposited in the lower airways or in the middle air. So MAMD is the one way. Second is basically geometry standard deviation, that is GSD. For dispersion measurement, most methods, medical aerosols are polydispersed, and an aerosol with GSD less than 1.2 is considered monodispersed. And respirable fraction, it is something which we commonly have talked much previously, probably not previously, but probably we all have learned about it in the past, is the proportion of aerosol that lies between 1 and 5 micron diameter. This particle size considered like highly likely to be deposited in the lungs. Particles with smaller MAMD could enhance drug deposition in infants and young children. So factors that affect intrapulmonary deposition. So there are two primary factors. One is aerosol related factor, and a second is the patient related factor. So first we discuss about aerosol related factors. One is particle size. Particles more than 10 microns are filtered by the nose. The larger the MAD, the higher the upper airway deposition, and particles with smaller MAD tend to have more peripheral distribution. Then second is particle velocity. This results from interaction of velocity at which the particle is generated by the device and patient's respiratory flow. So fast aerosol has got tendency to get deposited in the upper airway only. And then third is hygroscopic property. Now hygroscopic is basically what happens when this humidity increases. Humidity leads to increase in MMND, and when MMND is increases, the itself leads to the deposition in upper airway only. So that's why humidity itself is an adverse event when we are using the aerosol therapy. Drug viscosity and surface tension. The addition of excipients with surfactant properties enhances drug delivery. More viscous fluid requires longer nebulization time. So this is about the drug viscosity and surface tension. Use of add-on devices like what we can say, the wall meter spacers, VMS, or spacers which you normally use. And then you all know that every spacer has got the static inbuilt electrostatic force. So that itself can affect the deposition of aerosol in the airways, and whether the spacer is any walled or without wall, that can also overall affect the deposition of drugs into the airways. If you talk about patient related factors, that is breathing pattern, the ability to perform a single inhalation versus a triangular breathing maneuver should be considered. Increasing inspiratory time increases intrapulmonary diffusion. So once MDI used, and if we increase the inspiratory time, so in a tidal valve, if you are increasing the inspiratory time, it will lead to the more deposition of intrapulmonary deposition of your drug. Large tidal valve increases intrapulmonary deposition. Breathing patterns of distressed or crying children decrease intrapulmonary deposition. So now this is something which is very common we witness in our day-to-day practice. As soon as we start giving nebulizer, the child starts crying. So crying child itself, not itself is a very good, it doesn't give that much of benefit to the child, because majority of the drug is not getting deposited in the smaller airways or where it is required. So the second is age. Intrapulmonary deposition increases with age because coordination improves and the child gets adjusted with the devices. Third is inspiratory flow rate. The use of low inspiratory flow maneuvers with nebulizer and MDIs enhance drug deposition. So if the low inspiratory, we can go with the MDIs and nebulizer, and with the use of high inspiratory flow maneuvers, DPI enhances the drug deposition. The nasal versus mouth inhalation route. Young children are preferentially nose breathers, so the chance of getting deposition is much better in them. The use of nasal route decreases intrapulmonary deposition by 50% in older patients. Then anatomic differences in young children and compared to adults, but this is something which we cannot modify, which is existing there. The larynx of infant is situated much higher, the epiglottis is closer to the palate. Pharynx and supraglottic tissues are less rigid and more prone to inspiratory collapse, so this also affects your overall drug deposition. The tongue is relatively larger than the oral airway, which also produces mechanical obstruction. Cognitive abilities. Now, cognitive abilities can affect even a child or even adolescent or even adult also. So impaired or undeveloped cognitive ability may limit the successful performance of the maneuvers and techniques that optimize the lung deposition of the medicine. And behavior. Crying making markedly reduces the intrapulmonary deposition, which you already talked. Acceptance of the interface. Now, suppose some of you want to give medication with MDI, but sometimes you are not able to give MDI to the very young child, then you have to use some interface like either walled spacer or only other spacer or face mask or for with the nebulizer. So acceptance of this, this is very important. If the child is irritable, the outcome will be not that good. Contrary ones means when the patient knows how to use device, but still it uses it incorrectly. So this is something unique, which is normally should not be allowed, and for that we have to repeatedly counsel the parents or patient caregiver so that this can be minimized. Adherence is something which is very important, because we all have witnessed that adherence is the biggest problem in management of all these aerosol devices. As soon as patient starts getting improvement, the parents either stop it or they make it on the SOS basis. So we have to, for adherence, the main important thing is we have to consult the parents or caregivers. We have to take much amount of time for that. So that adherence is very important, and it can be monitored with the use of devices and less precisely by reading the refill history. And definitely the financial part is associated with the adherence, because these all devices are sometimes very costly and it is parents are not able to afford. But if you can convince them, then in long run, the finance is comparatively, the financial aspect is comparatively, or the cost is comparatively lesser as compared to the oral medication and admission. And that is my personal experience says we get better result out of it. Patients with more advanced lung disease tend to have more drug deposited in the central airways, and patients with severe bronchospasm will have decreased intrapulmonary. Now, common modes of aerosol therapy, commonly we use three. One is pressurized metered dose inhaler, that is MDIs. Second is DPI, and third is small volume nebulizer or nebulizers, which we routinely call it. Under ideal conditions, when used correctly, the amount of actual delivered to the airway is comparable with all three types of devices. So nothing is like that. One is much better than another. Only thing is it varies according to the age group and patient's cooperation. So we will see each devices one by one, and we'll see which one is better for which age, what age group, and we can choose device accordingly. However, both the MDI and DPI are more convenient. Both are self-contained and can be carried out in purse or pocket because it is easy to carry. Nebulizer is a bulky instrument because it requires compressor to generate enough amount of pressure. So nebulizer is little bit difficult, but some patients or for especially domestic purpose, they prefer nebulizer only. And not many patients or parents, they still feel that MDI or DPIs are addictive rather than nebulizer. So they continue with the nebulizer till 6, 7 years, 9 years. So, but still we have to we should always try to convince them that these two devices are as good as of the nebulizer. But MD and DPI has got one limitation that they require specific steps to be followed and precise order to achieve optimal airway position to desired therapeutic effect. MDI includes a canister, contains drug, excipients, propellants, which is stored under pressure, and canister has a metering valve. Nowadays, most of the canister has got the, most of this MDI has got the meter dose in general because they have got they shows the number of doses which are already existing or which are being used. So that is something very good with nowadays the devices which are available. Previously, the MDIs were there, but not the metering was not there. But now most of the companies are providing with the meters, and it contains a plastic actuator that consists of actuator seals, nozzle, and mouthpiece. Aerosol are released at very high speed from the MDI. MDI requires coordination between actuation and inhalation. Shaking the canister before actuation and actuating the canister right after the shaking are critical for drug formulation and suspension. Now, again, there is something like it again varies from company to company, product to product, and from molecule to molecule. Like it has been already mentioned, like in fluticasone, it is very important that how much time how much time gap is between the you are taking after shaking the canister and then actuating, then giving patient this inhalation. But like something like beclomethasone, probably you can take more amount of time that you can give slowly, but in fluticasone you cannot keep that much of time delay. You have to give immediately after shaking and execution. Further, a new HFA, that is hydrofluoroalkane propellant, requires slow de-inhalation followed by a 5 to 10 second breath hold. Now this breath holding is always not possible, especially in younger child or infants. So, but HFA is nowadays utilized in almost all type of MDIs. Wall holding chamber can help those patients unable to coordinate actuation with breathing. So this is something which is very useful for younger children or toddlers, and it can be used easily. The use of MDI with a incorporated dose counter is very important. And earlier, I have been, I can say before 7 8 years, I was used to do that whether the canister is empty or whether it's a fill, you can just dip it into the water and can see whether it's a half filled or half empty, and whether it starts floating and submerged. All this type of variety of things we were used to do. But now the latest guidelines say you should never submerge to estimate the fullness of the canister, and because meter doses are already there. And patients should also be aware to need the prime MDI to mix the medication properly and should consult the packaging. So that's why it has been already mentioned that you should always you should always instruct caregivers or parents to read the package itself which is available with the canister, because every company has got their own way of these things. So better to be on safer side. Either we should be very much acquainted with all these things, or parents should at least should go through before starting giving the MDI. MDI require periodic rinsing of the boot to prevent crusting, which obstruct the delivery of medication. Now this is a we all have seen when MDI, we must have seen. So this is just an which I have adapted from one of our book only. This is actuator. This is mouthpiece cap. Here basically actuator nozzle. This is mouthpiece which child or any person can keep into the mouth, and this is canister which is here applied here, and this is something metering valve, and this is actuator seat where this valve gets adjusted. So this is a which in case an operationalized version of dissected version of your MDI, and which is used. And when child is too young, here we apply the spacer for taking the help or for the proper coordination. So what is the intended patient to whom we can give 3 years with spacer and face mask, more than 3 years with spacer and without face mask also we can use, and we can just directly give the mouthpiece in the child's mouth, and child can directly do inhalation exhalation. And adults with spacer and mouthpiece Either adults can directly take, can also take, but here sometimes they may need spacer for the proper execution of the device. Patient with good head-eye coordination they can directly take the without spacer also. A face mask is needed with physical or cognitive limitation. Children require adult assistance for actuation. So when the patient is having some physical limitation or cognitive limitation, or when they are not able to do coordination properly, better to use with either spacer or with a face mask may be needed in some time. Advantages of MDI is what? Portable, light and compact with counter is there. So combination drugs are available. Majority of the products nowadays are available with combination. So, but we cannot say that all the drugs are available, but yes, definitely they are available. Shorter treatment times, reproducible dosing, no drug preparation needed, difficult to contaminate. As this device is too small, the contamination chances is a little bit lesser, or comparatively it's very less. So disadvantages definitely is there because it requires head breathe coordination needed if used without spacer. So in pediatric population, I think we should advise, this is my personal opinion, even in adolescent, I prefer that they should go with a spacer, although it's quite a little bit cumbersome for them, or they don't willingly take it. They usually switch over to DPIs as they cross over to that age group. But better to use with spacer or younger child beginning with the mask. So coordination is usually not that good in the younger children. Patient actuation, breath hold required. Drug deposition is fixed. Foreign body can lodge inside the actuator boot. High oropharyngeal deposition is not used with the wall holding chamber. And consider canister nozzle can be obstructed, not periodically. And there is, so there are certain disadvantages which are maybe there. Now this is something, a soft mist inhalers. Again, this device I have never used. I don't know how it works, but again, this is available in literature. Any one of you must have used it, then definitely you should share how it looks. I have never seen the picture also, but it is something interesting. SMI deliver more drug than MDI, especially at lower tidal volumes. So it is something good for pediatric population. Release propellant-free aerosol. That is tiotropium is the device which has been approved by US FDA for asthmatic patients. The speed of the aerosol is 10-fold slower than the MDI. So lesser the speed, more is the better is the deposition, which we could understand. The aerosol cloud lasts in suspension 3-fold longer than the MDI. The device is marketed for use without a VSC, that is volume holding chamber, a wall holding chamber. But however, a patient who can't or won't perform the recommended inhalation technique should use a VSC. So the only drug that currently used has a US FDA drug administration approved pediatric indication is tiotropium for asthma more than 12 years of age. And tiotropium is nothing but the long-acting anticholinergic medication. Devices need to be discarded 90 days after opening, and device has dose indicator that turns red when 7 of the 30 doses are available. Priming and cleaning are also necessary just at of the MDI. So this is something about the SMI, and SMI, it has basically turned the base of the device in clockwise until it, sorry, I don't have picture, otherwise I would have shown you, but open the cap that covers the mouthpiece, release the aerosol, exhale fully, close the lips around the mouthpiece while keeping the device in horizontal position, begin to breathe slowly and press the release button. Do not block the lateral opening. And once inhalation is completed, 5 to 10 second breath hold is suggested. Now, if you ask me, it seems somewhere like DPI, this type of DPI is similar kind of that, but this type of DPI requires a lot of strong inhalation process, and the tidal volume here it is working with the normal tidal volume only. So that is something unique, and probably it will be in future if we can get more number of drugs with this device, and whether it's cost effective or not, we will come to know in later part. I don't know whether it's available in India right now, but if it is available, probably in future it will be definitely of use in asthma management. We talk about DPI. DPI has got two different mechanisms. One is patient has to first load the medication dose into device before every dose, and second is medications are already loaded in the form of like capsules or strips or whatever you can say. To dispense the medication from DPI, the patient must first prepare the dose for inhalation per manufacturer instruction. Again, every manufacturer, every device has got their own manufacturing instructions. So whatever devices which we are using or which we are instructing to the patient, first of all, we should be comfortable and we should be able to instruct properly to the patient. Then only we can see the compliance will be better with this all type of medications. When ready, the patient should inhale forcefully and quickly through the mouthpiece, followed by 5 to 10-second breath hold. Now, the DPI are devices that can deliver medications to the lung without the need for suspending medium. Here, DPIs doesn't require any aerosol sort of thing. So basically, not aerosol, but certain mediums like liquid medium or certain suspension is not required. And basically, the formulation use a carrier such as lactose are used basically for carrying this dosage of medications. DPIs are mainly used in pediatric patients to treat asthma, like bronchodilators, corticosteroids, or combination of steroids with long-acting bronchodilators. And in cystic fibrosis, tobramycin as an antibiotic, which is given in the form of DPI. Currently, all devices available are passive and breath actuated. The inspiratory force required of the patient to overcome the internal resistance of the device is responsible for removal of DPI when it is released from the device. Now, here up to this, everything finds okay with the DPI, but the main problem starts when we talk about the inspiratory flow, which is required to take the DPI. That is, now I read one book, it was mentioning somewhere, say 20 to 30 liter, one book which was mentioning 30 to 40 liter. So I tried to quote it towards higher side because probably another book, maybe even some other, but I have quoted the other version, like 30 to 40 liter per minute for the most devices, which requires high inspiratory flow to inspire this, to use this DPI. DPI can deliver large quantity of drugs than pressurized MDI inhalers, and many formulations use a carrier such as lactose. Type of DPIs, single dose devices. These devices require placement of capsule in the device every time when before you are taking. Multi-dose devices, common reservoirs, individually packed blister strips or cartridge, and incorporated dose counter. So something, this is about DPI. DPI is like, this is something single dose device here, which we have to put the capsule here. This is something mouthpiece, and this mouthpiece is usually covered by this cap, and here piercing button. Once you place this capsule and once you locked it, this you have to press this button like this, and then the drug will be available for the inspiration. Similarly, this is another company, another manufacturing product, like here the piercing button is here, capsule holder is here, and this is cap, this is mouthpiece, and once you pierce, then the capsule get punctured, and we have to keep it in the mouth and produce a strong inhalation, and this drug is inhaled. So this is something about the single dose, and these are multi doses. This is something, this device, and again it has got counters are available here because there are multiple doses are available in it, and this is some other company products. So there are n number of products may be available in the company and market. So depending upon the devices, we have to explain patient. Breathing manual with the DPI. Once the dose is loaded, patient should exhale first and be careful not to breathe inside the device. Because what will happen when the patient will exhale inside the device, it will humidify the capsule content or the drug. And then the next time when child or patient will try to inhale deeply, the amount which will be delivered or which will be inhaled will be lesser than the required. So the result will be not that good. So better to exhale out and then put this mouthpiece inside the mouth, and then go for the strong inhalation, followed by a patient has to hold breathe for 10 seconds and repeat if indicated, depending upon the medication which we are using. Now in this device, or especially in any other devices, what we always recommended when you are using steroids, the child should always spit, should do gargling and spit the water, because the reason is that if it is not done, then the lot amount of drug will get deposited in the mouth and can produce a lot of side effects, especially in the case of corticosteroid. It can lead to candidiasis and dysphonia and all that. So what is intended patient? 5 years without having any physical or cognitive limitations. So advantage is small and portable, propellant free, breath actuated, built-in dose counter, no drug preparation is needed, difficult to contaminate. But peak inspiratory flow is required, needed is 30 liter per minute is required. Each DPI is designed differently, vulnerable to humidity, limited range of drugs are available, high oral deposition as compared to MDIs, and difficult to use by very young and very old. So in the very young and very old, we cannot use it. And as compared to MDIs, especially MDI with spacer, the drug deposition is much higher in DPIs. Choosing the correct device for the patient, practitioner should realistically assess the ability of their patients to correctly use DPI. Although age and cognitive ability should be suggested of the patient's ability to use a specific device, but it has been observed that DPI is as such advisable. It is any child more than 5 years can use DPI, but practically it has been observed child less than 8 years is not able to use it consistently, and especially when the child is having acute asthma attack or child is having difficulty in breathing, at that time DPIs are not useful. So at that time, best thing is either MDI with spacer, or if the child is too young, even mask can be attached. Like we all know the Ciplas one mentioned, one is available, that is baby with a Ciplas spacer with a attached mask that we can use. With other devices may be available. I know you only want this one, that's why I talked about that particular company. With optimal inhalation technique, most patients will taste little or no powder in their mouth. So if we are using DPI properly, there should be minimal amount of powder should be deposited in the mouth, and taste should not, because it contains lactose, so the sweeter taste will be experienced by the child. But if it is large amount of getting deposited in the mouth, then it can produce complication, and it suggests you that drug is not deposited in the lungs, but it is getting deposited only in the oral cavity. So it suggests that this device is not very much useful for the patient. Then third is nebulizer. Nebulizer convert a solution or suspension into inhalable mist with the aid of a gas source. Now gas source can be the compressor, can be the oxygen, which can be used with the help of available piped oxygen, which is available in wards or ICU facilities. So compressors are not the nebulizer. The nebulizer is the chamber where we mix the solution with either saline or with which we use the normal respules, which we directly pour into that chamber. Drug delivery usually delivered in pediatric patient include bronchodilators, anticholinergic, corticosteroids, epinephrine, and antibiotics. Intended patients less than 3 years with face mask, more than 3 years with face mask or mouthpiece, adults with face mask or mouthpiece, patients with physical cognitive limitation that preclude MDI or DPI utilization. A face mask is needed with physical or cognitive limitation. Children require, and children always require adult supervision. Advantage: can nebulize a variety of drug, can combine medication, drug doses can be modified, minimal coordination. In this, basically unique feature of this is coordination is not required. It can be given to all age group child, even if you want to start to anyone, and ease of use of all ages. Normal breathing pattern is sufficient enough for taking this device or utilizing this device. Longer treatment times, equipment used is comparatively larger. That is disadvantage. It is very difficult as a hefty instrument to carry everywhere. Electric or battery power source or gas source is needed. Equipment varies, potential for contamination, because this is something which can transmit infection in the ICUs, and is one of the common variant which lead to the contamination. And these devices require periodic cleaning or disinfection. Inadvertent drug delivery to eyes with masks. So some kind of control. Different types of small jet nebulizers are available, like continuous output, breath enhanced, and breath actuated. Now continuous output, which majority of us see in our daily practice, and majority of hospitals have got this kind of only, that is continuous output, and it has got low cost and widespread availability. They generate and release aerosol during inspiration and expiration, generating large aerosol waste and exposing the caregivers also. Attending a 5 centimeter corrugated tube distal to the patient increases the drug delivery. So if we can add the corrugated tube distal to the patient, it can increase some sort of reservoir effect and can increase the drug delivery. And disposable units should not be used, but definitely in our setup, or especially in the lower income country setup, disposable unit to keep on using. But nowadays, what at least we have started doing, we are keeping those units for further use, and we are using for at least 4-5 days the same nebulizer. Otherwise, we don't throw it as such. Then second is breathe enhanced nebulizer, who generate and reduce aerosol during inspiration and expiration, but increase their output during inspiration by means of air entrapment facilitated by one-way wall system. Verify that patient can open the wall and take advantage of increased efficiency. Then third is breath actuated nebulizer, which is basically actuated during inspiration only. Some devices are modified form of continuous output jet nebulizer with one-way wall. So some jet nebulizers or continuous jet nebulizer can be also modified with the application of wall system, and which doesn't actuate it, which doesn't allow to expire during the expiration. And other devices have a spring-loaded one-way wall and produce aerosol only during inspiration. So there are a lot of different type of devices are available, but majority of even private practitioner or majority of hospitals still using this continuous output. So this is a variety of, like, this is continuous output which we use. That is breath enhanced, and this is breath actuated, in which only the inspiratory time nebulization is used. And here inspiration, expiration, both time nebulization is given, but it is predominantly the wall system doesn't allow to during inhalation, doesn't during exhalation, but during only the inhalation. So gas source or compressor used for home care, and for hospital care we can use the central oxygen. And when sometimes it may happen that compressor not working efficiently because of air filters are not working properly. So a compressor has to be managed properly time to time, and air filters in the compressor has to be changed periodically. Tips for patients using nebulizer, which you have to always tell them that when the nebulizer is using, the nebulizer cup increases. Tapping should be done when the nebulizer cup increases, the level of nebulizer cup increases during drug delivery. So we have to keep on tapping because some of the mist get deposited in that. Use of single dose vial is recommended to avoid infection. Sometimes, that solution is available of say 5 ml, 10 ml. Rather than using that, the respules are preferred because it avoids the infection. Drug work output markedly decreases after spurting begins, so should be stopped. Solution or suspension left in the nebulizer after treatment is complete is called a residual volume. It varies from 0.5 to 2.2 ml depending upon the model of the nebulizer. And increasing the loading volume will improve the drug output, but those devices with higher residual volume will also increase the treatment time and instruct the patient to maintain the nebulizer in upright position. So whenever the nebulizer is given, it is always better to keep it in the upright position. It helps in the proper drug delivery. Interface and inhalation technique. While there may be less pulmonary deposition of medication when using a face mask instead of mouthpiece, this difference is unlikely to have significant clinical effect. So whether you are using mouthpiece directly into the mouth or you are applying face mask, clinically it doesn't make any difference. But use of a face mask generates facial and ocular exposure, which is definitely can create some issues. Dermatitis has been reported with administration of corticosteroids by face mask, and isocoria has been reported with administration of anticholinergic with the face mask. So preferably if the child is able to take, it is better to give with the help of mouthpiece. Most specialists suggest that children whose mouthpiece who is capable of taking mouthpiece, it should always be given with the help of that only. Poor seal of the face mask markedly reduces lung delivery of the drug. Blow by technique, but just by keeping face mask in front of the face and or by just pushing the mouthpiece into the face doesn't have any much impact, so should be always avoided. Front loaded face masks are more efficient than bottom loaded face masks, especially when the seal is not right. So this is a front loaded face mask. Here the front loading is done and here is the bottom loading. Probably majority of the equipments which I have seen in these are the bottom loaded face masks only. Few must be having this front loaded. I have seen one or two such kind of, but majority of our hospital are having only this one. Do not occlude the holes in the face mask because doing so does not increase the drug delivery and can result in rebreathing of the CO2. Some masks and interfaces favor transnasal delivery. This could be alternative for patients less than 18 months of age because they are obligate nose breathers. Crying markedly, as we all know that all this crying reduces the intrapulmonary deposition. So patient has to console anyhow, although it is little bit difficult, especially in the early time when you are using first or second time this nebulization, child has got tendency to cry excessively. So any soothing effect if we can apply, any soothing thing which you can do, probably it will improve the drug delivery. Cleaning of the nebulizer is very important because cleaning is important to prevent the device from malfunctioning. Tubing that connects the nebulizer and compressor should not be submerged in water. Vinegar solutions are ineffective in cleaning Pseudomonas infection. After each use, perform proper hand washing, disinfect the nebulizer from tubing and disassemble the nebulizer. Clean the nebulizer mouthpiece and mask with water and dish detergent. Remove any visible secretions. Rinse the nebulizer, face mask and mouth with sterile water, which can be prepared by boiling tap water for 5 minutes. And place the nebulizer on an absorbent towel to air dry before storing on. Now, this is something about the cleaning. This is not disinfection. Disinfection, which we can done once a day. If you are using 2-3 times a nebulizer a day for a particular patient, then at the end of the day, it has to be disinfected. There are two methods of disinfection. One is cold method and other is the hot method. Cold method is soak the nebulizer and other parts in either 70% isopropyl for 5 minutes or 3% hydrogen peroxide for 30 minutes, then rinse it off with the sterile water. And heat method is if it is recommended by the manufacturer, sometimes it may damage the device also. So if it is recommended, then you can go soak the nebulizer and parts in boiling water for 5 minutes and microwave the device with while submerged in water in microwave safe receptacle for 5 minutes. Wash the device in dishwater for 30 minutes. Water is at least 70 degrees. There are different varieties, mechanism by which you can do, and use an electric steam sterilizer. So there are different variety by which you can do the heat methods. Device recommendations, or cumulatively if we see what different devices we can use for infants and children above 5 years of age. So less than 3 years of age, nebulizer or meter dose inhaler with wall holding chamber or properly fitting face mask. 3 to 5 years of age without any physical limitation, nebulizer or MDI with wall holding chamber and mouthpiece, because mouthpiece is preferred. If it is not possible, then go for wall holding chamber with MDI or with nebulizer. And with physical limitation, MDI or nebulizer with wall holding chamber and face mask. So this is something about infant and small children. Children more than 5 years of age, without any physical limitation, nebulizer, MDI or DPI with mouthpiece. So anything which you can use. With physical limitation, nebulizer or MDI with wall holding chamber and face mask. So this is something same as of the infant and small children. Adolescent and adults without physical and psychological limitation, nebulizer, MDI or DPI with mouthpiece. Now here in adolescent adults, if they don't have any problem, they can directly take MDI also, but only thing is we have to ensure that taking it properly. Even DPI, DPI usually they prefer because of the, instead of nebulizer or MDI, they prefer DPI because it comes easily in the pocket or in the purse. And second thing is same with the MDI also, but accentuation of MDI is a little bit, always quarrelsome, so we don't know whether they will be able to do it properly or not. So it is always advisable. MDI is preferred, but only thing is we have to ensure they are able to take it properly. With physical and psychological limitation, nebulization with face mask is preferred one. And if unable to physically generate a minimum peak inspiratory flow rate of the 30 liter per minute, now SVN or nebulizer or MDI with mouthpiece is preferred. So that is something which we have to talk about when we are in this particular group. We cannot give DPI. Now, how to see whether a child can produce this much of inspiratory flow or not? So some of the companies or some of the devices are available in the market which can give an idea whether this much of inspiratory flow is generated or not. And if it is generating, then DPI can also be used. Common classes of medication suitable for aerosol short-acting beta agonists like SABA, salbutamol, and levosalbutamol. Although it has been not many times we using levosalbutamol. Theoretically, it's levoisomer should be having lesser side effect, but if you see the literature, I don't think it has got that much of excessive good effect as salbutamol produces the same effect in this, the toxicity or the side effect is not that great with the salbutamol. Overall cost effectiveness is much better with salbutamol. So, but it vary from person to person and from physician to physician, what is their personal choice. LAVA is long-acting beta-2 agonist, salmeterol, formoterol, and arformoterol. Arformoterol is given in the books. I don't know whether it is available in the country or in India or not. So I don't have any idea. Short-acting anticholinergic, we always use ipratropium bromide. Long-acting anticholinergic antagonist like tiotropium, which I said, SMIs, SIMS, which we have already discussed about. Anti-inflammatory agents, budesonide, fluticasone, beclomethasone, cyclosonide, and mometasone. And each of the described medication can be administered individually, but there are also various combinations of these commercial drugs. And examples of popular combination like salbutamol and ipratropium, salmeterol and fluticasone, formoterol and budesonide. So there are a variety of DPIs and MDIs are available in the market, which we can be used according to the need. SABA is basically short acting. So basically the action typically produces within 3 to 5 minutes and provide relief to 4 to 6 hours. Usually we say it can be given repeatedly, say up to 4 to 6 hours, the effect, because it lasts for 4 to 6 hours. But sometimes in the cases of acute exacerbation, it can be given more frequently, 3 to 4 times a day. We always advise, but sometimes it can be given more frequently also during exacerbation. Addition of short-acting anticholinergics to SABA may further enhance bronchodilation. So normally in case of exacerbation, we usually add up ipratropium bromide along with it to make it more effective. Current evidence-based treatment guidelines for both asthma and COPD suggest that continuing need for more frequent administration of higher doses of SABA alone or in combination of ipratropium says of your poor overall control or core symptom control. So they require something better modalities for control of the for the prevention of basically acute exacerbation. LABA is basically salmeterol formoterol, which I just talked about. It produces its onset of action typically in 15 to 60 minutes and lasts for 12 hours. And it is administered usually twice a day, morning and evening, and more frequent doses is not recommended. Patient taking a LABA should use their LABA sparingly and never combine two LABAs, and LABAs are not indicated for the long-term monotherapy of asthma symptoms. So it should not be used isolated LABAs or not at all integrated for management of you can say asthma. But LABA usually utilized in for as a steroid sparing agent. Then anticholinergic, the long-acting anticholinergics are also indicated for the sustained control of bronchoconstriction in patients with asthma. Taken once a day, tiotropium blocks the muscarinic receptor subtype M3 on airway smooth muscle, preventing acetylcholine from activating the receptor. When tiotropium is combined with a LABA, we stimulate the beta-2 receptor or bronchial smooth muscle. The overall improvement and bronchodilatation is much better than which is observed with the individual drug. So that is something, a combination which probably is in the pipeline, may come out somewhere in the future. So steroids, inhaled corticosteroids are intended primarily for prevention of inflammation and prevention of exacerbation in the future. And the prescribed dose should be the lowest needed to maintain sustained control, which will be greater determined by the degree of severity. When a moderate to high dose of ICS alone fails to achieve sustained control of symptom, the addition of LABA is typically recommended as a steroid sparing agent. Now, something inhaled antibiotics, a few 1 or 2 slides about that. Inhaled antibiotic therapy with currently available preparation is safe and effective in patients with cystic fibrosis. Patient with bronchiectasis caused by cystic fibrosis or other etiologic origin, example like primary ciliary dyskinesia, post-infectious diseases, have chronic bacterial colonization with different organisms, example Pseudomonas aeruginosa and MRSA. Tobramycin and Estronom are approved by the US FDA for the treatment of Pseudomonas in patients with cystic fibrosis. Other drugs which are off-label use like amikacin, tobramycin, gentamicin, ceftazidime, colistin, vancomycin and ciprofloxacin, but they are not yet recommended by or approved by the US FDA, but they are still used off-label in variety of conditions. So treatment against Pseudomonas in patients with CF, all FDA-approved inhaled antibiotics are drug-device combinations. Currently approved formulation include for tobramycin, either it can be given in the nebulizer format or with the form of DPI. So it is not available in MDI format. So tobramycin delivered by nebulizer, treatment lasts 15 minutes, is usually dosed at 300 milligram twice daily, 28 days on and 28 days off with a standard nebulizer. And tobramycin delivered via dry powder by DPI, supplied a 28 mg capsule, aluminum blister package, is usually dosed at 4 capsules twice daily. Again, the same frequency, 28 days on and 28 days off. So 4 capsule morning, evening has to be given. Second drug which is allowed by US FDA, that is Estronom, delivered by a nebulizer, 75 mg of lipophilicized powder that needs to be reconstituted with 1 ml of sterile diluent before inhalation and used over 2 to 3 minutes, and it has to be used 2 to 3 times a day. Now, adverse effects of aerosol therapy, because it's a cumulative adverse effect of all aerosol therapy. While rare, there are potential adverse events associated with aerosol drug therapy. The degree of any complication will vary with each drug, its dose and dosing frequency, as well as with the type of device being used. Excessive dose of both SABAs and NABAs can result in cardiac excitation, nervousness, tremors, and difficulty in sleeping. Paradoxical bronchospasm has been reported in some patients after they receive a few doses of SABA or NABA for the first time. So oropharyngeal deposition of ICS can result in candidiasis or dysphonia, depending on the so it is more common with DPIs, but yes, it can happen with even MDIs also if it is not properly utilized. Respiratory infection can also result if nebulizer parts are not properly cleaned after using periodically disinfectant. So this is in short about aerosol and all. So
it is not in short. It is one of the most extensive presentation and one of the most important presentation I believe in this very time.
yeah.
And you have actually explained each and everything in a very calm and composed manner. It was an incredible presentation.
Thank
We
you,
have
sir.
Sandeep Reddy with us as a mentor for this oxygen session.
Yeah.
And in case he will be he wished to add something, then Dr. Sandeep, please take over.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Dr. Prasad. It's been an extensive session and it was a wonderful session. I think you've covered most of the points.
Yeah.
Regarding the spacer, I think I will concur with you that I'll still recommend people to give spacer even for about 10 years or 12 years because it's very
Sure.
difficult for them to coordinate.
Sure.
Regarding the antibiotics as an inhalation, we did use colistin for VAP when we had some pseudomonas which was resistant to most of the drugs, and it was only sensitive to colistin. So it did work as a wonder in those cases. And regarding insulin administration as inhalation, it was initially tried, but then since we do not have any control over the amount of drug which is delivered through inhalation route, it was scrapped off. So there are no newer studies regarding insulin as an inhalation. And regarding the nasopharyngeal catheters, as you've already rightly said that it is difficult. We need a lot of nurses for them because it is just a tube which is inserted, and there is a lot of chances that it keeps displacing, poking the posterior pharyngeal wall, irritating the mouth. So it's not much used in the common setup.
Yeah.
I have a few slides and points which I would like to add, but Dr. Nitin, do we have time? Around 5 to 10 minutes?
I think, yeah, we will conclude in this session only, although it is already over 30 minutes, but it's okay. We'll go ahead for 5 to 10 more minutes. Yeah.
So I think most of you would know all these points, but then just to brush it up. So we commonly use Venturis. So Venturis, they work on a principle called Bernoulli's principle. When we have a pipe in the bottom where we allow 100% oxygen to flow through it. So all these have a certain FiO2 which they can deliver. So using high flow oxygen through this cannula, there is entrapment of air through the pores which are on the sides. So depending on the diameters of this Venturi sets and also the ports which are on the sides, they determine the FiO2. So this is the Bernoulli's principle by which this Venturi works. And regarding the proposed mechanisms by which HFNC work, one is, as you already pointed out, that it washes out the CO2 which is present in the dead space. So that is one. The second one is it generates PEEP, or it also maintains FRC. So there is a study which quoted that it provides a PEEP of about 7.5 centimeter of water when the HFNC was set at 60 liters. So this generation of PEEP is usually depends on the size of the nostril. So if you are using a thick cannula which is covering most of the nostril, then we get a good amount of PEEP. Also, we will have to make sure that the mouth is closed. If the mouth is not closed, the PEEP that is generated is usually lost. So what we would like to use is, in case of an infant or small children, we can put a pacifier so that they can suck on it and maintain that PEEP. So that is one point. And since our UG days, we've been looking at these tables that providing 1 liter of FiO2 will give you 4 liters of oxygen. So, but that is not usually true. That is usually depends on the inspiratory flow rate which is generated by the patient. So if you look at a human who is an athlete who is generating around 30 liters per minute, and if you give only around 2 to 6 liters for him, during that time, there is air entrapment. So there is dilution of oxygen. So that is the main purpose that HFNCs were started. So if we use only 6 liters of oxygen and he's breathing the rest through the mouth or the nose, then the amount of FiO2 which is generated near the lungs is around 21%. So basically whatever oxygen which we are giving is getting diluted. But if we are using a high flow nasal cannula and we are providing 60 liters of 45% FiO2, then the amount of oxygen that is reaching to the lungs is almost nearer to 45%. So that is why high flow has gained a lot of importance before and even during the COVID period. And also HFNC is rightly called as heated humidified high flow nasal cannula. That is because the air that is coming out is heated and humidified. So as we know that we have mucous membrane on the pharyngeal wall, which usually heats up and also humidifies the air which we are taking in. So a lot of energy is used up by the body to generate this heat and also humidification. So if you use this heated humidified air, we are conserving some amount of energy which can be used up for healing purposes. And also it helps in mucociliary clearance. And as you already told them that it is well tolerated because the patient can feed, and so they are more comfortable. So so there have been some studies which showed that this study was published in 2011 on 60 patients. The main outcome was to see if the patients went to NIV after using HFNC versus a standard mask. So if you can see, the failure percent was only 10% in case of the high flow nasal cannula. This Florali trial, which was done in 2015, was one of the most commonly stated trial. They did not show any difference in intubation rates when it was compared with non-standard oxygen therapy. So this was one of the trial which put HFNC behind. But then with the personal experience, I think everybody would agree that HFNC have saved a lot of children and even adults from going into intubation. Also, whenever we look at the complications of oxygen therapy, the first thing, and most of the time, first thing which always comes in our mind is regarding the generation of oxygen-free radicals. But there are many other complications associated with oxygen therapy, I think, which are worth mentioning. One is most of the oxygen which is delivered is dry. So it dries up to our mucosal membrane and also dries up the secretion. The second thing is the oxygen-free radicals. They affect the bronchials and then affect the trachea and bronchioles as well. And the next is absorption atelectasis. So if we imagine this is the alveoli, this alveoli has nitrogen and oxygen in. So whenever the oxygen is absorbed, there is nitrogen still left behind in the alveoli. This nitrogen is maintaining the alveoli patent. But what if we wash out the whole nitrogen and we are left behind only with oxygen? This oxygen is absorbed, but there is no air left behind to keep this alveoli patent. What happens then? There will be atelectasis. So this is why providing a large amount of oxygen can lead to absorption atelectasis. And also in case of COPDs, where the high CO2 levels are usually compensated, and they lose their hypercapnic respiratory drive. And they depend on the hypoxic respiratory drive. In these patients, if you keep on giving oxygen, the respiratory drive is lost. And as we know that giving high oxygen will cause vasodilation, which will result in increasing left to right shunts. So pulmonary blood flow will increase in those cases. And also giving high oxygen has shown that peripheral vascular resistance is increasing, but then the increase is not that much, around 1 to 2 millimeter. And giving hyperoxia can cause cerebral and coronary vasoconstriction. And also we know that it is used for euphoria. And we already know that giving fluctuating oxygen levels to a newborn will cause ROP, and also it can lead to decrease in erythropoiesis. If there is no oxygen, if there is hypoxia, then it can cause pulmonary vasoconstriction. As you can see, there is a study which was published earlier which showed an increase in the pulmonary artery blood pressures from 21 to 35 when there was hypoxia. So as you can see, this pulmonary hypoxia can lead to high pulmonary vasoconstriction levels. And also, I would recommend using oxygen as a drive for nebulization instead of air when you are using beta agonist. This is because whenever we give beta agonist, this beta agonist also dilate your blood capillaries. So the alveoli which is collapsed is not getting ventilated. So we are wasting a lot of perfusion to the unventilated part of the lung. So to decrease this intrapulmonary shunting, we should always nebulize salbutamol and levosalbutamol with oxygen. And then whenever you have a patient with status asthmaticus, as you've already said that short-acting beta agonists, when combined with anticholinergics, have better efficacy. So what I would like to add is start with short-acting beta agonist, give it for some time, and then combine short-acting beta agonist and anticholinergics, because the initial SABA will give adequate, might give some place for the anticholinergics also to add. And then cleaning of spacer is one of the most important thing which we'll have to advise your patients, because we've seen that most of the patients put their finger inside the spacer, because the spacer is a zero stat spacer. That is, it does not have any static. So this zero stat will prevent any adhesion of these aerosols onto the walls. So if we lose this static, these particles will go and fixate to the wall, and the drug is not delivered at all. So we'll always have to emphasize about the adequate proper cleaning technique to the patients, and also we should advise them to just dip it in a tub with surf and then put it aside for drying instead of cleaning with a cloth or a paper towel. And then inhaled corticosteroids, most of the people refrain themselves thinking that inhaled corticosteroids will cause a lot of side effects. But this is not that true. Depending on when inhaled corticosteroids, the amount of side effects are very minimal when compared to the problems which you will face with, if you do not treat the asthmatics. And then regarding the type of nebulizations to be used, or if you want to use an MDI or a PDPI or a nebulizer, the particle size will influence your treatment a lot. So even if you start with a nebulizer because the patient is not able to coordinate it, it is advisable to quickly change over to MDI, because MDIs generate smaller fine particles which go to the peripheral lung. So this is some of the points which I wanted to add.
Very good. Dr. Prasad, is there, if at all you have any questions on any other participant is having any question, then me and Dr. Sandeep will be taking those.